Hello, and welcome back to the Mindfulness in Education Summit. I'm Dr. Zoom Vo, and I'm one of your hosts. Today, we'll be talking about resilience, which is the theme right now. And we're going to be talking about the science of resilience with Dr. Richie Davidson, whose research focuses on the neuroscience of emotion and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation, mindfulness, and related contemplative practices. He's published over 400 articles and chapters. He's co-authored 2 best-selling books. He's the founder and chair of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin. And in 2018, he was appointed to the governing board of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. I've been a longtime fan of Dr. Davidson. I'm sure many of you have as well. So I think it's a real treat to speak with you, Dr. Davidson, about resilience in education for students as well as educators. So thanks so much for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to ask you, even before we start talking about resilience and mindfulness, could you offer us an experience of what that feels like, an embodied experience? And then we'll kind of unpack it and talk about what it is and what the science of it is. But can you just walk us through a way that we can experience it in our day-to-day lives?
Sure. All of us have had the experience of having some adversity. To paraphrase the bumper sticker, stuff happens. It may be relatively mild. We may have had a difficult conversation with a spouse, with a child, with a coworker early in the morning, and then we have to go to a meeting right after that. And I think many of us have had the experience of having the emotions that are stirred up in that first difficult conversation bleed over and color, if you will, the subsequent meeting. That is, I think, a pretty common experience, and that's an experience that reflects a relative lack of resilience. We define resilience as the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. And so people who recover quickly are more resilient. This is something really important, and we think that it is a key constituent of well-being.
Great. So, you know, if we're thinking about meditation and contemplative practices, could you guide us through what that feels like? Like, could you guide us through a guided practice, for example? Would you be willing to do that for the audience?
Sure, we can do a guided practice anytime. I mean, I'm happy to do it now. How many minutes do you want me to?
Maybe 2-3 minutes, something that could be done during a workday.
Okay. Well, for viewers who are listening to this, you don't need to actually watch anything. You can simply bring your awareness into the present moment, into your body. You can keep your eyes open or closed, whichever you're most comfortable with, and sit in an upright posture. We like to sit in this way to remain alert, but not too tight and not too loose. Relaxed, but awake. And so bringing our awareness into our body and simply noticing whatever may be present, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, doesn't matter. Simply bringing awareness into our body, into this present moment. And as we do this, recognizing our motivation for wanting to engage in these kinds of practices, recognizing that when we calm our mind and when we open our heart, it is beneficial not only for ourselves, but for all the other individuals with whom we interact directly and indirectly. And so let's spend a few moments together reflecting on this altruistic motivation for practicing and recognizing that when we show up and we are fully present with a warm heart, it is beneficial not only for ourselves, but it's really an act of generosity for all of those around us. So this kind of practice, we can open our eyes for those whose eyes have been closed. This kind of practice of simply anchoring our awareness in the present moment is enormously helpful. And scientific research shows that it can facilitate resilience in the way we're talking about. That is, not make a person into an emotional zombie, but rather help them to recover more quickly following adversity. It doesn't blunt their emotions. It simply enables us to express our emotions in a more context appropriate way so that we can have a strong emotion when it's warranted, but then we come right back down to baseline when the context changes.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I think when you shared that practice, I certainly didn't experience it as emotional numbing. I didn't feel like a zombie. I think one of the phrases and practices that really struck me was about connecting with that altruistic motivation, having a warm heart. And a lot of them talk about mindfulness in the lay press is about presence, which is certainly a big part of it. But you really brought in that attitude of altruism and warm-heartedness as well. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important in addition to being present?
Well, warm-heartedness and altruism and compassion are important aspects of contemplative practice. There are specific meditation practices that are designed to cultivate these qualities. And we know from scientific research that they have different effects on our brain and our body than simple mindfulness practices. Both of them we think are important, but they are somewhat different in their impact. And in order to promote well-being, it's important that individuals engage in a variety of practices to cultivate all of the core elements of well-being. Mindfulness or awareness and compassion and qualities related to compassion are two of the elements of well-being, but there are others as well. And so we think that an emphasis exclusively on mindfulness is unbalanced. It is like imagine doing physical exercise where all you're exercising is your upper body. And you ignore your lower body, that is going to lead to a kind of imbalance. And it's ultimately unhealthy. And we think the same is true if one cultivated mindfulness exclusively. We believe from all the scientific evidence that well-being is multifaceted. And in order to cultivate well-being, we need to recognize all the different elements and nurture all of these elements so that we are not led to a state of imbalance.
Wonderful. Could you tell us about some of these other elements and how mindfulness is related to these elements? I mean, for example, some people might say, well, compassion is part of mindfulness. It's not really separate. And then I'm sure there's many other elements as well that are related to mindfulness or not. Could you tell us a little bit about some of these other elements and the relationship to mindfulness, the way that you view it?
Certainly. In our framework, there are 4 pillars or 4 components of well-being. The first we call awareness, which is where mindfulness would be. We prefer the term awareness because it is more basic and more neutral. It includes mindfulness, it includes attention. It also includes a component which we think is particularly important, and that is meta-awareness. This is something psychologists and neuroscientists have studied quite a lot over the last decade in particular. And meta-awareness is knowing what your mind is doing. It's the monitoring function of the mind. There's much of the time, amazingly, when I think most people actually don't know what their mind is doing. They're sort of on automatic. And knowing what our mind is doing is, we think, absolutely central to transformation. And so without knowing what your mind is doing, we really compromise our ability to transform. So that's awareness. The second pillar we call connection. And connection involves those qualities which nurture successful interpersonal interaction. Qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. And while it might be true in the abstract sort of hypothetical that mindfulness includes those, the fact is that we can develop them more directly and more quickly by cultivating them explicitly. And if we think they're important, why not cultivate them explicitly? Since we know that there are strategies that we can use to do that, and we know that they involve brain mechanisms and other biological mechanisms that are different from mindfulness practice. So that's the second major component. The third component we call insight. And insight is insight into how our minds work. And particularly, it is about self-knowledge, knowledge of the self. We all have a narrative about ourselves that is very much a part of who we think we are. And understanding the nature of that narrative at a deep experiential level is really important for well-being. So at the very extreme end of the distribution, there are people who have a lot of negative self-beliefs and who hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. And of course, that is a prescription for depression. And one of the key elements of well-being is understanding this narrative and having a healthy relationship to this narrative. And ultimately, this involves really direct experiential understanding of what the self really is. And so this is something also that's absolutely fundamental to well-being, and we believe fundamental to resilience in particular, because when you grasp onto the self and you hold the self to be an entity which is fixed and immutable and unchangeable, it will cause you to show a lack of resilience and to have a great deal of difficulty in recovering following adversity. So the fourth pillar of well-being, or the fourth component, is purpose. Having a true north, having a sense of where your life is headed, that goes beyond oneself. And there is a lot of research which indicates that purpose is really crucial to well-being. And in fact, in people who are in their 70s and older, having a strong sense of purpose is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity. And that's after carefully controlling for medical history and all kinds of other things. So it's really important. And with regard to well-being, what's particularly important is aligning our everyday behavior with our sense of purpose, and having more and more of what we do be part of our sense of purpose. So can a person get to a point where she or he can experientially grasp that taking out the garbage or cleaning your bathroom is actually related to your sense of purpose? It's not something isolated. And so that is something also really important. And again, in each of these four domains or four components, there are specific practices that are designed to cultivate each of these elements. And in order to promote human flourishing, we need all four. If you just develop one to the exclusion of the others, it will lead to imbalance.
I love the way that you're describing the balance. And I'm wondering if you could take us under the hood a little bit and tell us what is happening in the brain, in the body, in the nervous system when we cultivate these capacities. And are there different areas of the brain, for example, that are being cultivated by different practices? What's happening? What do we know?
Well, we know a lot about the first two components, about awareness and connection. We know less about insight and purpose, although we know some about each of these. With regard to awareness, we know that practices to cultivate awareness involve circuits that are important for attention and also for monitoring. And so, one area of the brain which is especially important for this is the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, really those two areas of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is particularly important as a hub to organize attention-related activities, and the anterior cingulate is really important in meta-awareness and the monitoring function of the brain. With regard to connection, what is central there are connections between the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum is really important in certain aspects of positive emotion, and it's a very distinct profile compared to what you see in mindfulness. With regard to insight, the meager evidence there suggests that areas in the brain that are important for self-referential processing are particularly implicated in insight, and strengthening the connection between the executive areas of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, and other areas that are important in self-related processing is really central to cultivating insight, gaining self-knowledge. With regard to purpose, we really don't know at this point in time what brain mechanisms are, although we do know something about the peripheral biology that is associated with it. I mentioned the studies of longevity, and there are correlates of that in peripheral biology that are associated with having a strong sense of purpose.
So let's talk a little bit about the biology. And because when we think about resilience, you mentioned it's our ability to bounce back from adversity, possibly stress. And we know that stress and adversity affect biology, affect health, affect the immune system. The American Academy of Pediatrics just put out a really wonderful position paper about how racism harms child health, likely through mechanisms of immunity and inflammation. So what do we know about how we can harness the power of the practices you're talking about if they affect our biology, our immunity, our stress, our inflammation, and our physical health, not only our brain health?
Yeah, so this is one of the more exciting areas of current scientific exploration, and it's the increased understanding of the connections between the circuits in the brain that are implicated in these four pillars of well-being and systems in the body that are important for health. As you mentioned, we know that the immune system and the endocrine system are really importantly related to responding to adversity and to stress. And when we don't recover quickly from adversity, what happens is that those systems don't come back to baseline. They remain chronically activated. And we need them to be activated when something stressful occurs. But where we get into trouble is when they don't recover, when they are chronically engaged. And so this is where resilience is so important. The famous neurobiologist at Stanford, Robert Sapolsky, wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. That was the title of the book. And in a nutshell, the reason why zebras don't get ulcers and why humans do get ulcers is because zebras have a really puny prefrontal cortex, and we have a much larger prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is larger compared to the rest of the brain mass in humans than it is in any other species. And it confers the ability for us to reflect on the future and to also reflect on the past. And that obviously confers all kinds of advantages, but it also gets us into trouble because it takes us out of the present moment. And so we can be engaged in a meeting, but we're stewing about a conversation that we just had, and that churns the emotions and keeps them going, even though nothing threatening is happening. There's no objective stress in the environment. It's simply replaying this episode over and over again in our mind. And so resilience, as we're describing it, involves the capacity to learn to control our minds so that we let go of these things. It doesn't interfere with us responding in the first place, but it allows us to recover quickly so that there's no stickiness of these emotions.
Sometimes when I talk to educators and in my own clinical practice with pediatricians, we know that there's many young people, children and teenagers, who are actually facing severe adversity all the time. In their neighborhoods, in their schools, there's violence, there's abuse, there's oppression and discrimination. And so maybe it's not all in their prefrontal cortex playing stories, but maybe their environments are actually chronically stressful. So what can we offer to populations, to kids and communities who are kind of in those really difficult situations of chronic adversity?
Well, I think that it's super important that we recognize that these are extremely complicated problems and that there's no single path or single solution. And in order to transform the world, we need to operate on many different levels. And so it's all well and good for people to cultivate these qualities that promote resilience, but if indeed they're in an environment that is continuously stressful, where there really is adversity that's chronically present, it represents a serious challenge, and we need to figure out ways of decreasing the adversity in the environment. It's not all going to be solved by training a person's mind. Now, having said that, I think that even in cases where there is a lot of adversity, there are going to be periods during a day when there is relatively less. And, I think that it's much more challenging in those circumstances to harness those periods, but nevertheless, it is still something that we can help to promote so that whatever little opportunity there might be, it can help to begin to reduce some of this impact. And we need to be careful, though, in reminding ourselves that this alone is not going to be the solution. We need to figure out ways of systemically changing the environments in addition.
So it's a complex issue. There's no one single solution, is what I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the child and adolescent brain. As a pediatrician, I specialize in adolescent medicine, and I know that adolescent brains are quite different than adult brains, and certainly child brains are quite different from adolescent brains. And there's a tremendous amount of development happening during those time periods. So what's different in the brains of children and adolescents compared to adults, and what kind of opportunities or challenges does this present in terms of teaching them these qualities and these capacities that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, so that's a really extremely important question. I appreciate you asking it. One of the significant dilemmas that we face today in modern industrialized countries like ours is that the onset of puberty in adolescents today is much younger than it ever was before in human history. And so even if we go back only 100 years, which in human history is really a very short period of time. In the US and Canada, the average onset of puberty 100 years ago was about age 16. And it's a lot younger today. And in certain subgroups in the US, the onset of puberty is below 10. And so the reason why this is particularly concerning is because the maturation of the brain, and particularly the systems in the brain that are important for regulation, are on their own time course, and they have not accelerated with the acceleration of puberty. And so what we have today is an earlier and earlier onset of puberty in the face of a brain that is not built to regulate that hormonal onslaught at that particular age. And so there's a really long, much longer period of time when an adolescent today is experiencing the hormonal changes of puberty in the absence of the neural machinery that is critical to regulate that. And so that is really problematic. And so, one of the most important things I think that we could do is to teach kids to harness whatever regulatory skills they may have. And it's not like kids have no regulatory capacities. They have some, but there is an inflection point in adolescence where particular neural systems begin to mature more significantly, and it enables these regulatory systems to be more robustly online. But in the meantime, we can teach kids skills of regulation earlier on in ways that will help address the challenges of adolescence and help to minimize the deleterious consequences of this longer unregulated period of puberty. So it's a super important issue.
Yeah, so I'm hearing it's a huge challenge, but also an opportunity to potentially alter the trajectory of brain development if we know how to harness it.
Absolutely. This is what we as neuroscientists think of as a sensitive period of development, meaning that the brain is particularly susceptible to influences, and the brain undergoes massive reorganization during this and other sensitive periods. And so if we can intervene during this time, it will have potentially multiplicative effects on subsequent development in the children.
So if we intervene, it could have lifelong benefits potentially.
But yes, quite possibly.
And where do you think we are with the science of mindfulness and contemplation and compassion in the child and adolescent realm compared to the adult realm? Can we say it's an evidence-based intervention for children and adolescents compared with what we know about adults?
The evidence is beginning to be gathered. It is not nearly as robust as the evidence in adults. But having said that, there are an increasing number of serious scientific studies of the application of this kind of training in children and in adolescents in particular. And I certainly believe that we know enough at this point in time to warrant the dissemination of these practices in a more widespread way. And of course, also the continued study of their impact, because I think through additional scientific research, we're going to learn a lot about how best to deploy these practices, which children may benefit the most from these kinds of practices, and so forth. So there's still a lot that we don't know, but I would say we know enough to warrant their dissemination. And certainly in contrast to, a drug, there are far fewer side effects.
Lovely. Let's turn our attention now to the teachers, the educators, the people, the adults who are working with children and adolescents in schools and educational settings. We hear that there's epic rates of burnout, of compassion fatigue, of secondary trauma. What can contemplative practices offer to the educators who are, struggling to do their best to serve young people?
Yeah, another great question. The stress of the teaching profession is pronounced. Here in the US, in many major cities in the US, the average lifespan in the teaching profession, that is the average number of years that a teacher remains a teacher, is frighteningly low. Uh, in certain places, it's under 5 years. And the cost of that kind of turnover is unsustainable and really difficult. So we need to do something to address those issues. And I think that these practices can be enormously helpful to teachers. Now, you mentioned the phrase compassion fatigue. I actually don't think there is such a thing as compassion fatigue. I think that's a misnomer. I think it's more appropriately called empathy fatigue. And we make a very important distinction between empathy and compassion. Empathy is taking on the emotions of another. It's experiencing the same emotions. And so if a teacher is dealing with kids who are highly stressed, who are very anxious, or who may be depressed, and she or he takes on those same emotions, that's empathy. But that's also toxic. Maybe a little bit of empathy is good to just get a feel, a taste. But if you remain in that place, it is toxic. And so compassion, on the other hand, is a disposition to relieve the suffering of another. And if you're dealing with a child who's very anxious, it's not going to be particularly helpful for the child if the teacher gets very anxious. Actually, what might be most helpful is if the teacher can remain calm, the very antithesis of what the student is experiencing, and also be able to actually genuinely help the student, and that is an act of compassion, and that turns out to be highly rewarding and not lead to fatigue at all, but actually lead to nourishment. And so what we need to be able to do with teachers in particular is to transform their empathy into compassion.
Yeah, I really appreciate that distinction. Certainly in my field in medicine, we experience those things as well. And I try to work with my physician colleagues around the difference between empathy and compassion also. How do we move from empathy to compassion, though? How do we actually train ourselves? Because I think for many people, we're used to experiencing empathy. That's why we came into professions like teaching or medicine. How do we train ourselves in compassion and understanding the difference?
Yeah, so there are really specific techniques. It's a kind of technology almost for doing this, and it's been very well studied. And it's been well studied in adults. It's also been studied some now in children. And there are randomized controlled trials showing the impact of these kinds of practices on the brain and behavior. They basically, many of them have certain elements in common. And those elements include these. You can take a person that you know, it could be a loved one, it could be a friend, it could be someone who you recognize but don't know that well, and you bring them into your mind and your heart and envision a time when they may have been suffering. And then basically what it involves is cultivating the strong aspiration that they be relieved of their suffering. You can coordinate this sometimes with saying a certain phrase like, may you enjoy happiness and its causes, may you be free of suffering and its causes. It might be associated with certain breathing techniques where on each out breath you send feelings of love and compassion toward whoever it is that you're directing this to. And it's amazing that this simple practice actually leads to very robust changes in the brain that we can measure. It also leads to changes in behavior and changes in peripheral biology. This practice is anti-inflammatory.
Wow.
It actually leads to decreases in pro-inflammatory cytokines.
That is really amazing. So what we do in our minds and our hearts changes our bodies and our brains.
Absolutely.
Well, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you if you'd be willing to share your reflections on one final question today. The field of mindfulness and meditation, contemplation, compassion, it's really changed tremendously in the last 10 to 15 years. It's mainstream. Everyone's talking about it. It's in schools and universities and hospitals. What are we missing? What is the next step?
Well, I think the next step for me is thinking about this as a public health issue and an urgent public health issue. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet today, virtually every person on the planet brushes their teeth. This is not part of our genome. This is a learned behavior. And we do this because we recognize it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And what we're talking about are practices that are important for our personal mental hygiene. And we're at the point now that I think, as you describe it, it's really true. It's gone mainstream. People are talking about how important it is. My wife is also a physician, and she at one point organized a meditation group in her hospital for other physicians. And one of the comments that she frequently got from her colleagues is, "Thank you so much for doing this. It's so important. I'm really happy you're doing it." And none of them ever showed up. So it's kind of like physical exercise where, lots of people, no one will disagree with you if you say that it's important for your physical health, but not everyone has yet incorporated it into their daily life. And so one of the things that I often say is that even if we practice for as short a time as we brush our teeth each day, if we actually did that every single day and nourished these qualities in our mind, this world would really be a different place.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to end with brushing our teeth and spending some of that same amount of time and energy cultivating our hearts and minds. So with that, I want to thank you, Richie, for your wisdom and experience. It's been really wonderful talking to you today.
Great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.